In essence, we have to somewhat understand the way in which the enemy thinks. We have to think about the way that the devil is going to cause doubt and interact with us of being in the world but not of the world. And so we have to be wise to understanding, but not succumbing to the temptations nor the pressures of the way in the way that the devil is trying to tempt us and pull us away from God. At the same time, the disposition that we're supposed to have is the way that we then interact with those that are around us. Sometimes this can be frustrating when we have the world pushing against us, when we have the world basically calling us names, telling us that we're unloving, that we're bigots, and that we're, whatever other adjective that you want to apply from the devil's standpoint and the way that he wants to try to ensure that we become disheartened, that we become discouraged against what we're supposed to do. Now, is it easy for us to become discouraged in this world? Well, absolutely it is. We can just look around us. And it's certainly, I think about, was it yesterday when they had the rally downtown concerning vetoing the abortion bill in which the House and the state Senate are trying to pass at this time to ensure that we don't continue killing babies. And so I'm watching this on the news this morning, and one of the things I'm seeing over and over has nothing to do with killing an innocent newborn child or an unborn child, but everything to do with the way in which a woman wants to choose her own health, but never mind the health of the child. And so when I think about the thousands that they showed on the news that attended something like this, the world is groping in sin, which shows the responsibility that we have concerning the Great Commission that God has given us. Now, when we think about the limited commission, the limited commission that's given to the apostles as it relates to the word limited that we spoke of last week is not found in the Bible. But as it relates to Jesus is going to tell his disciples to go out 2 by 2 and sending another 70 also, he tells them to focus strictly upon the house of Israel. Why? Because that was the core message of whom he wanted to address at that time. It wasn't time yet for the Gentiles to be pulled into the fold. That was going to come later in the plan. That's where Paul is going to come into the picture. But right now it was limited as it related to the particular area in which they were going out 2 by 2 to preach and to teach, because they had a limited amount of time while Jesus was there. And so he wanted that opportunity to ensure, as he's sending them out, I kind of look at this like it's OJT for his disciples and the apostles. Because he's going to send them out as he's still there to teach them as they're encountering different things. But what does he also say? Listen, when you go out, I want you to stay in that house if they'll accept you. And I want you to teach them till they understand. And if they reject you, then you dust your feet off and you move on. So he gives them 2 types of commands. He says, one, if you have the opportunity, someone's receptive to the gospel, use the opportunity and do that. If they reject you, and we know that people are going to reject us, then guess what? It's time to dust off your feet and move on to someone who's going to be receptive to what we have to say. Why? Because we know that our time is short. Because we do have such a limited amount of time on this earth. Even Jesus said, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, because when it is night, no man can work. Jesus knew that he only had a short span, less than 4 years, to accomplish more than we could ever fathom, because he was sending a message to the world that this was going to save their souls, but change the covenant by which they were associated. And so when you think about this limited commission, not in its scope of importance, but rather in the limited amount of time and the individuals with whom they're trying to evangelize. And so as Jesus now is going to begin to focus on his apostles, we begin to kind of see this transition in the latter part of the Galilean ministry, because now what's going to begin to happen is this is now going to, kind of make us aware as those that are looking at Jesus are kind of having this I think this moment of revenge or maybe vengeance to say, hey, look, here's this king that we're finally going to get. Here's this king that's finally going to sit upon the throne of David, that's going to rule over the nation of Israel, and that's finally going to ensure that the Romans get what's coming to them. And Jesus is going to have to literally push them away and fight them off, and almost to the point of running from them because they wanted to take him by force. And so when you think about that, here's Jesus, and we can only imagine his disposition is kind and loving and compassionate and showing mercy and healing those that are sick and taking care of those that are poor and expounding upon the concept of the disposition that he wants his apostles to have and all of these different things. And now they're going to say, oh yeah, well, we're going to make you our king. Now, they're going to try and attempt to make Jesus Christ the king of the nation of Israel. But first, he's going to again try to teach them and showing them who he is and what he has to offer. And in just a moment, we're going to look at the 7 I am statements that we see in the book of John and the importance of those. But this is really kind of his first idea of teaching this concept of what it means to be the bread of life, because he relates back to the manna in which the fathers were fed in the wandering in the wilderness and the importance of that. But the way that the Israelites looked at it then was how? What is this, and what's this got to do with us? You know, God, you're the one who took us and drug us out of Egypt. Things seemed to be much better when we were in slavery back there, but now we're wandering in the wilderness. We have nothing to eat, and now we don't even know what you're feeding us. And so Jesus is going to use this particular example to teach them this concept of what the bread of life is. But even then, because the Israelites struggled with this whole spiritual concept, because to them everything was physical, even then, as he's going to address this idea of being the bread of life, they're going to struggle with that to say, how does he think that we can eat his flesh? Because he's claiming to be the Son of God. How does he think we're going to do this? So, again, the mind goes to the physical rather than looking at the spiritual. Because if you recall, last week we even talked about the idea in which Jesus, as they came to him after he had fed the 5,000, remember, they still came to him and they still had this physical mentality. Because even when he performed the miracle, they said, Jesus, you know, all these people are here. How do you expect us to feed them? They weren't looking at the spiritual of who he was. And Jesus finally says, all right, bring me what they have. I can almost see as if he's somewhat growing impatient with this constant of trying to teach them, but at the same time, that's not who Jesus was. Because Jesus always used these moments as teachable moments. And so after this limited commission of him being the bread of life, the crowds did not want to willingly let him go from being the physical manifestation of the king in which they wanted. And so again, I think they were building up in their own minds and their own self-image of what Jesus was going to look like. That again, even they questioned, you know, we don't know what he physically looked like. We don't have a physical description other than what we read in the Old Testament that shows there was nothing really great about him concerning his physical appearance, because God wanted them to be drawn to his disposition, to his compassion, to his character of who he was, not what he looked like. Because, you know, in society tends to focus, unfortunately, on the outward rather than the inward. Because God does what? I don't judge the stature of a man, as it related to King David, when they're like, you want this little boy to be the king? God says, I don't judge based upon the stature, but rather on the heart. That's the same thing we have to focus on. We don't get to limit the expectations of who might respond to the gospel by simply looking at someone and going, you know what, I don't think they're a good candidate. I don't think they're going to want to respond to what the gospel teaches. And so again, we can't know the disposition of someone's heart. We don't have that ability, but the gospel can certainly make that happen. But certainly after, you know, Jesus provides these miracles, he's going to proclaim that he's the bread of life. He said, and Jesus said to them, I'm the bread of life, and he who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. Now, to their minds, again, the physical is what's important. But Jesus, as he's beginning to now teach his apostles and his disciples here the importance of focusing more on the spiritual things, because even later, we know the apostles are going to run into the same problem. And so he wants them to understand the importance of this. So notice what he says here. After this premature attempt, after he makes this statement of being the bread of life, he says, when he gets in the boat, he went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. And those men who had seen the sign that Jesus said, this is truly the prophet who has come into the world. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, he departed into the mountain by himself alone. So after he makes this statement that he is the bread of life, of which they're going to see, and as he's expounding upon these things, they're still not understanding the spiritual concept, and they want to take him by force to make him a king. You know, what I find interesting about this, when you're reading this, can you force anyone to do something as it relates to him being put in a powerful position? Well, maybe to an extent you could. But what did they hope to accomplish? And this is also, when you think about this, did they ever see Jesus do anything by force? or by a physicality by which he inserted himself into a particular situation that he thrusted his physical appearance upon someone and his physical ability to force them into doing something. Do we ever read Jesus doing that whatsoever up until this point? No, we don't. But they wanted to literally take him by force. Maybe they had the idea that he was going to use these miracles and suppress and enforce the Roman Empire to basically bow down to him. But that wasn't in God's great foundational plan either. But they wanted to literally force him to make him this king. And so you have this premature attempt to make Jesus a king. And said, now the Passover feast, which was, or a feast that of the Jews was near, and this was about that particular time. But now we come to another kind of physical manifestation as it relates to the belief and the faith that the apostles had in who Jesus was. And so all of this is the same time frame that these things are beginning to unfold. And so as we continue to press forward, we're pushing closer and closer to the cross. Jesus, again, knows his time is limited here. So when you have that premature attempt to make Jesus the king, we have another particular situation in which Jesus is going to, and it's interesting, one particular verse and one particular account of this situation says that as Jesus was walking on water, he almost walked past them until they began to call out. Now, would that tell us something about what he thought maybe of the apostles at that time? Probably. But that he's also going to use this as another teaching tool of them placing their trust in who he was based upon him being the Son of God and not simply on the things that he could accomplish because he was the Son of God, not the miraculous effort anyway. Because Jesus did that from the standpoint of simply showing his deity, his authority, and that he in fact was the Son of God. Many times Jesus would try to accomplish this without doing those things first. He did show compassion upon the poor and the desolate and the sick and other individuals in that nature. But at the same time, if he could accomplish it through teaching, that's what he wanted to do. But when he does this, we see that Jesus, wanted to spend some time alone. If you look in Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 24, we have this particular account. And it said, but the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a spirit, and they cried out in fear. So they thought they saw a ghost. Said that they cried out in fear, verse 27, but straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And here's where we kind of see this idea of trusting in Jesus. And Peter answered him in verse 28 and said, if it is thou, or if it be thou, bid me to come unto thee on the water. And Jesus said, okay, come. Now, there was no discourse. Jesus said, okay, I'll bid you to come unto me, then come unto me. And it said, come. And when Peter was come down out of the boat, or the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. And he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Now, there's a few ways you could look at that verse. Could it be that Jesus, because, Peter seemed to me somewhat of this personal project for Jesus. Not that all of his disciples and apostles weren't, but almost as if there's a little bit more focus on Peter in his faith because maybe he saw the way in which Peter struggled from time to time. Whether it was through him denouncing Jesus as the Son of God, whether it was him saying, you're not going to wash my feet, whether it was Paul calling him a hypocrite and calling out his hypocrisy later. But then we see Peter being, the brave, courageous apostle as he stands up in Acts chapter 2 and preaches that gospel sermon. But it could be that there's something that Jesus is focusing on, but it's interesting that Peter's the one that tends to come to the fore, to the foresight often here as we see, Jesus giving these examples and teaching concerning faith. But it says, then it says, and when they were coming to the ship, the wind ceased, and when they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, of truth, thou art the Son of God. So here's another example of Jesus doing something, especially as he's being the deity that he is, calming nature. And then again, this is proof positive or proof text for them to say, well, he is the Son of God, because this is not the first time this has happened. But when he says and asks Peter to come unto him, Notice verse 23, and when he'd sent the multitudes away, he went up to the mountain. This is afterwards to pray. And when the evening come, he was alone. But when you think, when he sends Peter off, or when he tells Peter to come to him, and Peter immediately begins to sink, because what's he look at here? What's again does he focus on? The physical. He automatically goes to the physical. He sees nothing but the physical around him. He stops concentrating on the spirituality of who Jesus is and the power that he has, and he's already seen this time and time and time again. Now, brethren, pray tell, how many times do we lose focus of the spiritual and focus on the physical? You know, we've been through rough seas before. We've traversed the trials of life, and we've come out on the other side. That's increased our patience and faith, James 1, 2 through 4. We've grown in our strength and in our faith towards God. We've believed in the power of God and His providence. We've come through the other side of the fire, and then we go through something again, and we fall back into the same physical temptations and manifestations of the physicality of what's going on around us, and we stop focusing on the spiritual aspect of trusting in God. So what does that do for our faith? What is God saying? Maybe He's saying, oh, you a little faith, when did you stop trusting? What was it that caused you to stop putting your trust in me? Was it because this time it got a little bit rougher? Was it because this time the sea seemed a little bit stronger than it did the last time? And so Jesus is going to ask us the same question. O ye of little faith, when did you lose your trust in me? Because, again, we know there's nothing in life of which we can travail or traverse or go through. That doesn't mean that God can't get us through it, at least to the amount of the trust that we placed in what's happening to us. But we do get caught up on the physical, don't we? Literally from the standpoint that all we see is what's happening rather than what can happen, and putting our faith in God. Because we lose sight of what God can do because we don't think He's doing it now. But that's never the case. We don't know that He's not working providentially in our life in that particular moment. Maybe it's that moment of test in our faith and ensuring that our faith is where it needs to be that we need that particular time. God is not going to tempt us. Let man know to say when he is tempted of God, or when he's tempted, he is tempted of God, because God cannot be tempted. James 1, 13 through 15. So we can't point the finger and think God is specifically putting something upon us. We have this idea that for some reason God is going, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. You know what, Johnny? It's time for you to go through some difficulties. Isom, guess what? You're next. It's your turn. God doesn't work that way because we have free will. Because what Isom goes through could be simply based upon the fact of what someone does to him. Not because he chose that particular moment or vice versa. But what Jesus wants His disciples to see is to trust in the spiritual and what you've already seen Jesus do. If Jesus has given us ample, not only information, but also evidence over and over again of His ability, and certainly God's ability to take care of us, wherewith along those lines do we lose faith and then succumb to the devil's doubt? James, go ahead. Say that again, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm.
Instead of feeding more on the spiritual. We do that even in Bible class, in sermons, this and that. You do a lot of entertaining people instead of digging into the Word.
Right.
To make them mature in the faith. You know what the problem is a lot of times. That's how we go together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But spiritually, we have an issue with things we can't see.
Yeah. Yeah, James says, we are what we feed upon. If we feed upon the physical, then that's what is going to manifest itself. If we feed upon the spiritual, that's obviously what's going to manifest itself. Dawn, go ahead. Right. Yeah. 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 Dawn makes a great point. We don't get to place conditions upon God's ability or trust as it relates to us putting our trust in who He is. That trust has to be consistent and constant. And we don't get to place these conditions and say, well, I'll trust you, God, if you get me through this. Well, you didn't get me through this, so my trust is going to wane a little bit now. And, next time I'm probably not going to trust you as much. But again, it's interesting how easy it is for us as we come out the other side of the trial to look back and go, yeah, I got this one. I put my trust in God. But then when the trial seems to kind of linger on and on and on, and we begin to wane and we begin to doubt and we go, okay, well, God, where are you now? Again, there's no conditions placed upon, we don't get to put conditions upon God. God puts conditions upon us because He's able to, being the Father. But we don't get to place conditions on God's love. We don't get to place conditions on His trust. And we don't get to place conditions on what He's going to provide for us. Because again, through His infinite wisdom, sometimes we don't know what God is accomplishing through us. We know that He's accomplishing something, but sometimes until we grow in our faith and grow strong enough, we have no idea what that's going to be. Chris, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Chris said, sometimes we want to hold grudges against God if we don't get our way. Well, when I went through this is the outcome I was looking for, and you didn't give it to me. And so again, we want to place conditions, then we want to hold grudges against God and say, well, until it gets right the next time, then this is how I'm going to feel about you. Leslie, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, Leslie, says, sometimes God, not sometimes, all the time, God knows what we need. He knows exactly what we need, and just because we don't get something doesn't mean that He's not providing us something else that's obviously going to be more prevalent or something that we're going to need at that particular moment. But again, we can't place conditions upon God and expect Him. God is not a circus clown that we're looking to perform, that wanting Him to perform. But that's the way some people treat God sometimes, as if He's a performer, and on cue, I need you to do what I need you to do when I need you to do it. So God, go ahead, now I need you to perform, and go ahead and do this thing for me because I'm struggling. But all the other times, I need you to stand over here in the corner, and I'll turn you on when I need you. Brethren, we don't get to treat God that way. But sometimes that's how we do treat Him, as if He's something there of a jack-in-the-box that we just wind up at a certain time and when we need Him to perform and do what we need to do. And that's just irreverent towards the holy God. Go ahead, Isom, then I'll get you, Stephen. Yeah. 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 Yeah, Isom says, trust is a connection. It connects us to each other and understanding trials that we've gone through. That's where Galatians 6:2 comes in, of bearing each other's burdens and the concept and how that builds us up. Another thing to think about when you think about if we don't go through these trials. So many people, somebody asked me, before class today about, how do you answer the question when someone says, how does a good God let these things happen? Well, okay, here's what I want you to understand, that when people ask me that question, I say, well, let me pose it to you this way. Now I'm going to tell you everything that you have to do from this point on, and you have no choice whatsoever. Well, what do you mean? Well, you don't get to have your cake and eat it too. So if you want to trust in God and believe in His precepts and His promises and what He's providing for you, and knowing that bad things happen because there are bad and unrighteous people in the world, you don't get to make a choice. But you see, you want your choice and you want God to perform at the same time. That's not the way God works. So people don't want their freedom of choice taken away. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you were reading my mind. So going back to Genesis, whenever God created the world, He made this perfect paradise, right? We messed it up.
Mm-hmm.
God
Yeah.
with mankind. But yet now, after God offers us another chance, we want to know, why aren't we getting what we want? Well, He gave us what we wanted,
Yeah.
what we needed. And then because of sin, it separated us. So really, it's hard to think about it in those moments. Whenever we don't get what we want, we're just frustrated. But it's really our own fault.
Mm-hmm.
It was really mankind's fault from the beginning.
Yeah.
It separated us.
Yeah. Certainly God offered up the Garden of Eden, what He provides for us, and then man made the decision to go against God's commandments. But He also offers the tree of life again based upon conditions, and He says you can have this, but there's a way in which you're going to receive that and approach it. Leslie, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, Leslie said, God is love, 1 John 4:8. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. And we come to Him from the expression of love based upon the love that He's demonstrated towards us, Romans 5:8, that God commended or demonstrated His love towards us. Even when we were sinners, He still sent Christ to die for us. And so we come to Him based upon love. That's the relationship that we have, and it's built upon what God has shown us, obviously through what He did at Calvary. So no one can say, well, God, what have you done for me lately? Because God has done more than we could ever fathom. But at the same time, this is also what we see the apostles struggling with. Is they're still trying to struggle with this whole mentality of trusting in the spiritual side of God. He's going to provide for the physical. And like someone said, it might not be what we want, but He's going to give us what we need. And He's going to provide solely for those needs that it might not be the physical desires that we want, but it's the spiritual in which we're blessed. So go ahead.
They're all based on free will. A lot of times, I normally tell them, if me and you disagree, the first thing I'm going to do is look at myself. But everybody wants to look at the other person. It's just like a parent with a child. Same thing, the child got free will. Make the child, if you evil because the child do this or do that? No. Do you allow the child to do it? No. The child had free will. They did it on their own. You will discipline the child afterwards, but the child had free will.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Free will is as you're saying, free will is a slippery slope for mankind because again, they want their cake and eat it too. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, as she's saying, Christianity is all about surrendering. That's where, Matthew 10 and Jesus telling, us as it relates to giving up our own self-serving kind of motives and picking up the cross and sacrificing ourselves and serving God. And it is about something much greater and far more, difficult sometimes to us, I think, to fathom. But again, we live in a very self-serving society, but that's been pushed since the beginning of time. You go back to the Garden of Eden, and you look at what Satan did. Surely that's not what God said. I mean, if you do this, he just doesn't want you to be like him, and your eyes are going to be open, and you're going to become like God's little g, and so make it about you. Well, again, that's the devil and his sly ways and his doubtful tactics has been doing that since the beginning of time. And it's nothing that's changed today. Johnny, go ahead.
God's will is perfect. Always has been, always will be. Ours is not. What we're talking about here, they wanted to make Jesus king. That was what they wanted. That was their will.
Mm-hmm.
God's will, and Jesus following that all the way to the cross is what made all that happen.
Right.
So it's almost like a battle. So our will can be made perfect if we're following and we're obeying. We can do that through the blood of Jesus, but it had to happen.
Yeah.
God knew the pieces, and we followed all the way through faithfully.
Yeah, Johnny said, it's about God's will. They wanted to make him a king and make it about them rather than about the plan of God. The gospel's a stumbling block. God says it. Paul said it. He said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ because it's the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Paul understood, but then if you go over into 1 Corinthians, Paul also understood of how hard it could be for mankind to be willing to succumb and trust in the gospel of Jesus Christ. In 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 18, he said, for the preaching of the cross is in them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved is the power of God. The world thinks it's foolish in what we believe. The world doesn't see nor understand how sobering the cross is, but also how great the cross is at the same time. Because it is, it can be difficult sometimes even as we look at the cross, because you think about the suffering, but you also think about the love. And you think about the freedom that we have now from sin because of that sacrifice. And the world can't truly fathom that until they've sometimes, and it's interesting, and I'm not negating this or saying there's anything wrong with this. When do people usually need God the most in their life? When they've never come to Him before. When they're going through some of the most difficult times. That's when all of a sudden people will get spiritual because they have no more straws to grab. They have nothing else to hold on to. And it's in that moment that they want to say, okay, I don't have anybody else to go to, so I'm going to get down on my knees and I'm going to pray to God and hope maybe He can do something for me. Now, is God going to reject that person? No, because He wants them to come to Him through faith and love. They still have to be obedient, but that's the first step in recognition to realizing the power of God. But at the same time, what happens many times that you see, more often than not, when the bad times go away and all of a sudden they're coming out the other side, who gets forgotten? Well, God, I don't need you anymore, so I'm going to put you back in the box, and when I need you, I'll let you know. That's not something we get to do. All right, any last minute questions or comments? I think we're about out of time. All right, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.